One of the reasons that equanimity is so important is because equanimity is the quality of the mind that allows wisdom to arise. It's the quality that is able to see things as they really are. And we say it in that way, the quality that allows things to be seen as they are, because in moments of equanimity, there's no reactivity. There's no aversion or attachment to what's being seen or experienced. There's also no delusion, because the mind is very clear. So it's said that equanimity opens the doorway to wisdom. Because basically one thing about equanimity is that it's hard to notice. Usually we notice a lot of the gross things that happen in the body and that happen in the mind. We're used to paying attention to those things like the hindrances or the places in the body where there's pain or even pleasure. But when the mind is really clear and there's no reactivity to anything that's going on, say to a moment of thinking, thinking is having to do with an unpleasant experience, for example, or we get so caught up sometimes in the unpleasant experience and we notice that, okay, that's really easy to notice. But moments when we're not caught up in it, that's harder to notice. You know, the mind is pretty clear. It's free from reactivity. So a lot of the times how we notice equanimity is that the mind is free of reactivity. It's not reacting. And sometimes no matter how long you've been practicing, you wake up to that moment, oh, there's that particular thought in the mind. The one that worried me or that caused me some kind of place in the mind that was uncomfortable. And you notice that it's fine, that thought's going through the mind. It's just passing on, it's just passing by. There's no glue. You know, some of those hindrances are like glue and it keeps you attached to that particular thing for a really long time. So I'm wanting to point out how it's so important to notice times when the mind is not reactive. When there's an absence of reactivity. And there could be many, many times when that's happening. But it's so subtle. And it's one of the subtlest experiences of the mind. Referring to the major teaching of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, this is the 4th foundation in the realm of noticing mind states. As with intentions, so with equanimity as well. Equanimity sees things as they are. It's having the ability to see with more wisdom. Sometimes we just get so caught up a little bit in the neutrality of it, of what we think of as equanimity, that we don't realize that what we're seeing is something more deeply. It's more deeply than the neutrality. It allows us to go more deeply into the view of reality, where we see the view from an experiential level. That's seeing universal qualities. For example, when equanimity is there and we're not caught up with attachment or with delusion with regards to whatever object there is, the mind sees really clearly. It's able to pick up the quality of the nature, which is impermanence. It's really able to see coming and going, changing, maybe in slow ways, maybe in very quick ways, that the mind can't keep up with it. But it actually notices that so much more clearly. It's below that level of neutrality into really seeing clearly the nature of things. And it brings equanimity to this quality that brings about the wisdom factor. That's part of the 5 spiritual qualities of the mind. Equanimity allows for wisdom to be seen and to be known. And it allows it in many ways. For example, the most conspicuous way, the way that the Buddha talked about the most, is seeing nature, seeing the impermanent nature. With equanimity in the mind, more still and quiet, not lost in any of the defilements, it's able to see sometimes the arising of an experience, the actual arising of the experience, not being caught up in the defilements. So it's able to see how it changes, and it's able to see how it passes. So just for example, in the rising of experience, some or most of you have already probably noticed that where the mind gets caught up in thought and doesn't even know when it's arising. It just knows it's in the middle of it and lost in it. There's also an ability to see the very beginning of a thought arising. Because the mind is so quiet and not reacting to whatever that thought might be, it just sees that it's arising. And in that moment, there's an ability to refrain from getting lost in it. It's just a thought, instead of getting lost in the content. So, for example, there's pain in the body. The pain is doing its thing. It's felt in its various changing experiences of the elements of the body: hardness, softness, tightness, tension, temperature, pressure, floating, heaviness, all of those experiences that are elemental and kind of beneath the concept of things. It's really able to see it, just that. The mind is not likely to get lost in, where is this coming from? Where is this leading to? Oh, this is an unpleasant moment. It's going to last forever. All of those things that we get lost in. So it's just able to see that experience just as it is, as a changing, elemental experience of the body. The quality of mind that allows mindfulness to see these things as they are is equanimity. Mindfulness itself is very strong. Equanimity sees things deeply as they really are. And it helps to be able to see the experience not as a concept, not as a thing. It sees it in its moment-to-moment experience. Just like we see hardness and softness in the body, or temperature in the body, we can see the various experiences of the mind in that kind of subtlety. So it's really a very important and essential experience to notice. In your own practice, it's not so easy to notice because it's so neutral. So we have to call it to our attention just to notice. First, we start noticing the mind isn't reactive. So we need to look, instead of the habitual places we go, we notice when the mind is not reactive. There's an absence of reactivity, or there's an absence of the defilements, an absence of the hindrances. We're not lost in doubt or anxiety or sleepiness or grasping or clinging or pushing away. Or they're very weak, lighter, they're weaker than usual. So this is a time when equanimity is starting to form, starting to be more prevalent and more strong and present in our practice. We're also able to see into the nature of quality, the passing away of something, that things arise, that they change, that they pass away. And it's able to see deeply like that because it's not caught up in the big stories that are putting together concepts of me or mine, even if it's just in this very moment. When we're not just seeing that arising or that changing, but it sees that moment totally disappear. The moment of thinking totally disappear. The moment of sensation in the body weakens, can disappear, can dissolve. So those are very, very important moments of wisdom that are going into the mind. You might not say, oh, I'm so wise, I understand that this is disappearing. We're just noticing. They're just being noticed. And they're happening. And the mind sees it clearly, just as it is. What deepens in the mind is the fact that everything is ephemeral. You can't really hold it. It just keeps moving on. And that's when the quality of anatta is understood. Not just anicca, impermanence, but anatta, the quality of not self. Because it dissolves just these moments of conditions arising, changing, and then passing away. And when one sees the passing away moments, that brings some insights to the mind. And you may not be able to put that insight together in words or a sentence, but that understanding is dropping into the mind stream. Wisdom is developing. And we can really trust that. So the anicca that we talked about in the morning of impermanence, first I mentioned anicca, and then there's anatta, which is not the self-nature of everything. It's the not self-nature of everything. And then there's also dukkha. We hear the word dukkha and we think, oh, dukkha is pain. Yeah, dukkha is painful. But the reason why it's painful is more underneath that word and description that we usually put to dukkha as painful. Because things are arising and changing and passing away all the time. And we can't really make a self out of anything. It's really unsatisfactory. And that's why the term unsatisfactory is the dukkha. Because we can't hold on to anything. There's nothing that's going to be totally always pleasant or always painful. We're not always going to be confused in a state where we can't really understand anything. I like to connect more with the word unsatisfactory than with the word pain, because sometimes, maybe some of you have noticed already, that there can be a lot of physical so-called pain in the body. But actually, when it's seen more deeply, it's just seen as phenomenon or as sensation. Whether it's painful or pleasant, it doesn't matter. It can be kind of heavily noticed. But it's just arising and changing and passing away. And that's when your mind has naturally more equanimity. A lot of times equanimity is there, but you're not even noticing it. It's important to notice it because when we notice it, there's an ability to have more confidence and faith in your own practice. So that wisdom factor can arise, and then it can arise with a faith or with a confidence factor. The balance of the two. So we begin to have more confidence in our practice that things can be seen more deeply. And in a way, that's more free because we're not getting attached to it, either to the pain or to the pleasure or to the confusion. We're not making it a sense of self, like this is me. This belongs to me. I'm always going to be this way. Instead, we see the selfless nature. Now, I do want to say that on a relative level, there's a sense of self that we live with. But we have to understand the two truths, that there's a relative level of truth and the ultimate level of truth. So what we're learning on the ultimate level are all these things with the aid of equanimity. All the other beautiful qualities that we're being taught as we get into the practice so that we can experience them in the Dhamma. So when we feel equanimity, what does it feel like? Just so we can recognize it in our own practice. It feels spacious. It feels whatever ways you might notice when you touch upon noticing equanimity. The mind can open and anything can arise. Felt strongly and quickly or tenderly and fiercely, and yet the mind doesn't have a reaction to it. It can see this is how it is right now. Not using those words, but just recognizing and acknowledging, okay, it's how it is right now. We just acknowledge it. And maybe a moment of reactivity arises, like aversion or attachment. There's equanimity mind right there. Yeah, okay, that's aversion. You know, hello, goodbye, It's coming and going. Equanimity is so important to feel it as a spaciousness. In the mind of equanimity, it is said that anything can arise in this mind without attachment or aversion or delusion that doesn't see it clearly. Achan Suchito, maybe you've heard this quote, and I don't really know the whole thing, but what I remember about it is anything, armies, butterflies, anything can be known with equanimity. So what's important about equanimity? When we see the pain of dukkha, when we see the pain of dissatisfaction, if equanimity is there, the wisdom arises in the mind that this is not permanent. And so it just allows that dukkha, or whatever we experience, the pain of dukkha to be. It just does its thing. It's just doing its thing, and it goes away. There's no lasting moment. And because there's no lasting moment, there's no lasting satisfaction. If something is pleasant, so we don't normally hold on to it, in that regard with the pleasant experiences, we don't hold on to that. Something pleasant arises, it's enjoyed. There's nothing that says you can't enjoy it. It's enjoyed. But that object and the pleasantness with it, the enjoyment with it, they all pass away. And that's what wisdom is seeing. And you're just ready for the next thing to be known. Arising, passing. So spacious. It's a good word to understand because it's not like this tiny needle eye that you have to go through where everything's perfect in order for life to be what we want it to be. There's calm, there's spaciousness, there's calm in the mind. Calm is not reacting. It's not looking for something else. It's not restless. So calm is in the mind. And then there's a balance, and also there's a balance of being able to see things as they are, seeing the wisdom without the reactivity to it. It becomes a very balanced mind. Equanimity can be described as spacious, calm, balance of mind, those three things. So not excluded with this is the fact that we have the ability because of wisdom, and it gets more present, that we start to know, okay, what's happening on this relative level? Those two truths, we understand more clearly what's going on in the relative and also the absolute level. So when we see things in the absolute, like seeing the three universal characteristics, anicca, anatta, dukkha, we're seeing things on that deep level, and that's feeding into how we respond on the relative level. When we respond on the relative level, because there's wisdom there, there's more ability to contact compassion or to contact joy if we're experiencing somebody else's joy, and we can have that joy with them. So there's an ability to have an appropriate response when there's equanimity. That's a very important aspect of understanding equanimity, that it doesn't mean that we're just standing there, maybe seeing a truck come by, and if we stand still, we'll get run over. We don't stand there thinking fear, fear, fear. We get out of the way. And that's the appropriate response. So if somebody's being hurt, we help them. And we do what we can to help. So the appropriate response with a kind heart, with a courageous heart, with the heart that keeps us safe and other people safe, we do that. There's this great misunderstanding sometimes in our society that equanimity is just like blah, 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 that like you're a blob and you don't do anything. But of course we respond. When there's balance and there's non-reactivity there, we can respond with the best of our own knowledge. We're able to access that. Like, what do we do in a situation now where the mind is not hanging on to how we want it to be? Or we're so mad because it is that way? Or we're calm, we're balanced, we see things as they really are. So this is when the absence of greed, hatred, and delusion is there. The absence of greed, hatred, and delusion. And in that moment, we can really notice that moment of equanimity. How often do we really pay attention to when there's an absence of greed, an absence of harming or hatred, an absence of delusion? My teacher, Kamala Masters, mentions how her teacher, Sayadaw U Pandita, used to call this moment getting really close to liberation. It's said to be high equanimity, seeing things as they really are. When we see things as they really are, we have this mini nibbana, a mini moment of liberation, because in that moment, we're actually free from greed and free from hatred and free from delusion. That's what is called mature equanimity. When that's happening a lot in our practice, where we're noticing the lack of greed, hatred, and delusion, that's mature equanimity. When we're not reacting, some people follow the instructions and this comes along. Oh, there's these moments of equanimity. They're there, and it becomes an opening for people to see, oh, my mind isn't reacting to that, or this mind, rather than identifying with my mind. This mind is not reacting to that. It feels more free from the defilements. And those are really purifying moments during that time. So these places can be unnoticed in the mind because it's very subtle. And this is one of the more refined experiences of the mind that we come to see in our practice. There are advanced, subtle mind states, mental states, that would be given like in a 3-month course somewhere at IMS or Spirit Rock. And usually it begins with Vedana, the pleasant and unpleasant and neutral. That gets fairly subtle when you really pay attention. And then bringing in intention, and that intention brings in equanimity. So as we notice pleasant and unpleasant, neutral sensations happening, if we really are paying attention and it gets more subtle, we're bringing in intention, and equanimity can show up there. Also, along with metta, with loving kindness, and karuna, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, upekkha. To notice equanimity is really harder to notice because it's so subtle. We can notice loving kindness, we can notice compassion, we can notice our own joy and other people's joy. It's harder to notice equanimity. So begin to notice when there's an absence, because that's when your mind is getting clearer and clearer. That absence of grasping and clinging, or the absence of the greed, hatred, and delusion. It's able to see the wisdom factors of the mind, seeing very deeply beyond a sense of self. Seeing anicca, or impermanence, seeing anatta, the not-self characteristic, clearly, and seeing dukkha, the unsatisfactory nature. When that is seen, we don't tend to hold on too much to anything. We tend to see things with wisdom, tend to respond appropriately and wisely. And that's how the Dharma works. Just kind of bit by bit going into the depth of the practice. Okay, so that's a little more Dharma and a little more ability to be in this world with less confusion, hopefully. And hopefully you will go on to see things as they are more clearly, more and more, and have the ability to notice equanimity in your own mind. One of the ways equanimity is described is not falling into extremes, catching the mind before it falls into extremes. So let's sit quietly. Let those words settle, let them filter through. In the Sutta Nipata, it's said, when faced with the vicissitudes of life, one's mind remains unshaken, sorrowless, stainless, secure. This is the greatest welfare. When faced with the vicissitudes of life, one's mind remains unshaken, sorrowless, stainless, secure. This is the greatest welfare. Just noticing as you're settling what's happening in the mind. Is there any sense of calmness or spaciousness where you're not attaching to any of the hindrances, grasping at something, pushing something away? Noticing those subtle moments of non-grasping and non-clinging. And seeing that where we do cling, it causes that dukkha. And we can really see clearly, especially as equanimity is encouraged and noticed, that there's no solid sense of self. Whatever we're attending to arises and passes. When are we noticing that the mind is clear and that there isn't reactivity to anything that's going on? Say, to a moment of thinking even. Or if we're caught up in a moment of thinking and it's a pleasant or unpleasant experience, we can notice that it's easy to notice. And we can return to that more spaciousness, not getting caught up in what's happening, but seeing it clearly from beginning to end as best we can. Looking for the mind that's clear, free from reactivity. Thank you for listening to the Dhamma. May the Dhamma rain sprinkle upon you, whatever got absorbed or didn't get absorbed, whatever questions might arise as you start having the brain be active again, perhaps, or maybe not.